So today we're going to be talking about refining long exposure images. Um, let me finish clearing this out. Everybody's saying hello. That's great. Hi, James and Jeff and William and Brad, Lewis, Sue, Suresh. Very good. And I want to mention, if you have any questions, feel free to type them into the questions box. I don't look at the GoToWebinar control panel that often because if I do, it takes up a good amount of space on my screen, uh, and that's not ideal. So I minimize it. Anyways, hi Tom, glad you made it. I'm gonna go ahead and minimize the GoToWebinar control screen. And again, if there are questions, feel free to type them into the questions box. I'm probably gonna save them to the end. So we'll have about a 45-minute presentation, and then any questions you have, I'm gonna attempt to answer. I actually realized when creating this presentation that I shoot kind of the same kind of stuff in long exposure in my own sort of practice, if you will. And there's a lot of other kinds of and applications of long exposure photography. And so I almost want to have another webinar, but with somebody else's or groupings of other people's pictures, talking about nighttime photography or painting with light or other stuff like that. The images that we're going to be looking at today are primarily landscape images, and they are shot like this with a in pretty much broad daylight or at whatever lighting situation I was at the location at the time. Nothing is in particularly crazy places or times in terms of I'm not on the top of a mountain at dawn in any of these, because I wanted to kind of make it a little bit more relatable, although there's probably landscape photographers out in the crowd right now who are planning ahead and showing up at the right time and so on. I kind of avoided some of those photos that I have to try and make it a little bit more approachable, but hopefully these things will still relate to everybody. So this first image is a scene that's actually about 45 minutes from where I live. This is Watkins Glen, and I shot this photo. I believe it's a 30-second exposure or a 25-second exposure. So just bordering on long exposure in my mind anyways. But I shot it with a particular filter that tends to skew colors blue, and it cuts off a little bit of the color spectrum. And so this kind of becomes a little bit problematic. And then I actually underexposed this one, and I decided I preferred this exposure to this exposure, simply because it was easier for me to sort of extract and bring out some of the textures in the foreground. So the exposure that I ended up liking more is, in my mind, not technically correct. But what we're going to do is take a gander at using some tools in DxO Photo Lab, and then we're going to go into Analog Efex Pro for this first image, because I want to show you a couple different techniques using Nik Software on this kind of photography, and maybe it'll help you to think slightly differently about long exposure photography and the things that you do with the Nik plugins. Actually, we'll come to this image when we open into Photoshop. This is a common occurrence. Excuse me. It's a common occurrence with certain filters and in certain situations, and that the flare that you're seeing here, this has happened to me on numerous occasions. There are solutions around it, but again, what sometimes happens is I come back to the house and I input my images and I say, oh, I actually like that image. That's a little bit messed up. I'm going to show you how to kind of correct the color cast and the flare that's occurring in that other image later on in the presentation. Anyways, let's talk about the photo. Let's get into adjusting the image utilizing some of the tools within DxO Photo Lab 2, and then we will open up into the Nik plugins. As one last sort of comment here, DxO Photo Lab Essentials comes with the purchase of the Nik plugins. So if you don't already have the Nik plugins, this software that we're in right now, which is a really powerful raw processing tool that pairs DxO's sort of camera department, research department with their software. Basically, there are modules that match cameras with lenses, and the raw processing software here it basically optimizes that combination. It will fix lens distortion, vignetting, potential sharpness issues with the camera and lens combination that you shot your images with. And in fact, you see this little icon in the upper right corner of these images here. These are images and camera combinations, sorry, camera and lens combinations that I haven't downloaded yet. So this is indicating to me that I should download that lens combination. I can show that if anybody's interested afterwards as well. Anyways, we've got an image. It's a little bit underexposed. Let's see what we can do globally, and then we're going to adjust using the local adjustments tool here in Photolab, because there's our handy dandy control points, that is U-point technology that's built directly into this software. So let's minimize some of these tools. On the right side of Photolab here, and this isn't an entire Photolab demo, I'm just want to describe what's going on here. On the right side, we have our essential tools, and I'm just going to go ahead and warm the image just a touch, because like I said, with this particular filter, it kind of cools the photo a little bit inherently, and I want to warm that up a little. Anyways, I just took the temperature slider over to the right a little bit. Another solution would be to use one of the preset settings if necessary or possible, or I could actually use the color picker. So I could actually click on the eyedropper and choose a particular color in here. I like the result that we've got. We're actually going to end up converting this to black and white. So I want it to be as neutral as possible, but at the same time, I'm going to end up muting all of these tones anyways. So it's maybe not the most important thing to worry about in this case. So moving into the DxO Smart Lighting, this is a really powerful tool as well. It kind of relights the image if possible. So what I did here is I just turned it off. There's a little sort of toggle switch that you can click on and click off. So this is the original exposure. You can see now it is underexposed for most of the scene here, but here's our after and our enhanced image. And I think it works pretty well. I'm going to actually bring this down a little bit. And what we're going to end up doing is bringing out textures and details selectively. Because if I use too much of this DxO Smart Lighting, watch what happens. I mean, obviously, as I bring it to the right, it's going to lighten everything too much, sort of dodges the whole image. But we end up losing a lot of detail up in the highlight section of the top of the Glen. So I don't want that in this case. So I'm going to go a little bit softer handed on some of the global adjustments so that we can bring out the textures and tones using the selective adjustments or localized adjustments with control points. So that's DxO Smart Lighting. The DxO Clearview Plus, this is a really interesting tool as well. I don't know if it's necessary here, but it's kind of like a contrast and texture adjustment. On this photo, it's kind of muting the highlights quite a bit. But you get this really interesting texture out of it as I'm toggling this on and off. In fact, let's zoom in where I'm kind of really seeing it the most. So here's at 80%. And if we toggle this on and off, I'm going to give that a second for the preview to clear. So watch what happens as we turn this on and off. So we get this really great texture. It's kind of taking the highlights down, darkening down, but applied globally on this image, it ends up flattening out some of the personality of the photo in this case. So we're going to apply something similar selectively anyways. But really great tool, especially for long exposure landscape, because oftentimes they can be a low contrast, and this is a good way of bringing back textures and tones. Okay, last thing that I wanted to show you in the contrast area here, I'm going to go ahead and check that checkbox on, and the micro contrast tool is a really interesting contrast adjustment. All of the effects that we've done so far are global, meaning it's going to affect the entire photograph, but watch what happens. And I think I'm going to leave micro contrast at about 16, but if I bring this up into the right, obviously this is way too much. I kind of relate this to a combination of things. It reminds me of the clarity slider within Adobe Camera Raw if that were combined with a kind of sharpening slider. Again, 65 is too high for this image, but you can see the result. It's definitely interesting. So I drag it into the minus or the negative, and really can be effective. In my opinion anyways, with long exposure, because oftentimes I'm running into issues with flare. Right, and so I'm lowering the contrast, so I'm getting less edge sharpness, and this micro contrast does a really nice job of kind of bringing some of that back. Again, you can use it as heavy-handed or as subtle as it works for your image. In fact, the fine contrast slider, the slider underneath micro contrast, has a similar effect to that. I'm going to go ahead and slide that to the right, but in this case at least, it tends to be adjusting it in smaller areas. For those who are, that's not a very good description, I know. So for those of you who are familiar with structure inside of, like, say, Silver Efex Pro, Silver Efex Pro also has a thing called micro contrast. No, sorry, microstructure. Shoot, we're gonna have to check that name. Anyways, it has, and I would relate it to that. Here now, I'm tripping myself up. But notice now how we're getting like a lot more tone and texture out of this contrast. I don't think I'm going to leave it here because to me it's a little bit too much. But take a look at the compare button. So here's the before. We did make some pretty significant density adjustments, brightening up those shadow areas. But there's the before. There's the after. We're really dialing this in and really getting a lot of that texture back. I don't want to leave that fine contrast up that high. And again, for a couple reasons. First of all, I think it was just too much for this image. And then second of all, I'm going to end up taking this into Analog Efex Pro, and we're going to kind of mute all of these things anyways. So I kind of just want to bring out the things that are, obviously draws of the attention of the eye. So I want to direct the viewer's attention through the image. In fact, before we go into Analog, check this out. We're going to move up into the top right area of the interface here. We're going to click on local adjustments, and the new mask button and all of these sections here allow us to selectively adjust the image, meaning everything that we've done so far has been global, and now we can apply control points to selectively tone and colorize or add contrast to, or structure or sharpening, basically any way we might want to. The way that these work is that you have to just click on an area to drop the point. This is going to work just like a control point does within the Nik plugins. I will describe those as well when we get into the Nik plugins. But basically, you just drop the point on the object that you want to adjust, and then you have a whole bunch of different sliders that you can go in and adjust with. What's really, really powerful about these particular control points in Photolab is that you're dealing with the raw data. Right, and that's an important sort of difference between, let's say, using Viveza 2 and using the control points within Photolab 2. Because in Photolab 2, this is a parametric image editor. We are dealing with the original raw files, if we shot raw files. And if we take this image into one of the Nik plugins, what it ends up doing is duplicating the raw file as a 16-bit per channel TIFF file. So it still has lots of information, and it's really handy and great. But again, the beauty here is that we're dealing with the raw data, and then these are always malleable. We can always go back and change these control points anytime we might want to. So it's a non-destructive workflow as well. And that's what really adds on, in my mind, to the use of control points here. So in this case, I want to just dodge the shadow areas a little bit. And in fact, I'm going to take this way too far, just so you can kind of see what's happening. This control point is basically looking for the object that I place the point on. It's not necessarily making a circular selection. It's making a selection inside of that circle. And what it's doing is it's looking for the similar tones, colors, and textures that I've placed the point on. And then it tries to figure out what I want to adjust, and it basically gives me a nice clean photographic looking selection. Obviously, if I go and take my exposure up 3 or 4 stops, it's not really going to look very good no matter what, right? But I can actually take the exposure up in this central area of the image, 2 stops, 2.35 stops. We can add some contrast. I can add some micro contrast, and now I'm directing your attention towards this pool here. 2 things on this. The adjustment that we've made are basically just contrast adjustments. Each one of these control points has contrast and density adjustments, as well as color adjustments, as well as sharpening adjustments. So we could actually go in and increase the detail in here. I can move into the color, and we can actually do selective color temperature adjustments using control points. So I can go and cool down that water a little bit. I'm going to actually, let's make it a little bit more green. So changing the color back to maybe what how I remember it being, and also the fact that this was an underexposed image, I might need to go and shift some of these colors around a little bit to kind of get it back to at least what I remember. Now, the other thing that's happening here is that this control point, it is actually making a selection and affecting some areas that I don't necessarily want. So we can do two things. I can drop more control points. I can size my area of influence. Oh, wow, I kind of did that out of order. I can size my area of influence, and or I can actually go and drop more control points. So if you follow my cursor down into the sort of lower third of the interface, right now you'll notice I'm on an add control point button right here. But if I move a little bit to the right, I can click on this protect an area. And this basically allows me to drop minus control points or control points that is going to remove the effect that this control point is placing. So watch what happens as I drop this minus control point on the rock, right? It goes and basically cleans up my selection for me. I don't know if I want the control point in there, but basically if I just click and drop the control point, I can drag it around and I can figure out where it works best, right? And if my idea is to kind of go in and direct your attention as the viewer, I can place these points wherever we see fit, and then we can actually go in and adjust them as well. Now, this first control point that we dropped is kind of like the master control point for the adjustments. So what I just did is I dropped a new sort of matching control point right in the water here, and I'm noticing that when I place it in the very brightest highlight, it doesn't do exactly what I want it to do. So I'm going to go ahead and just drag this into an area that's a little bit darker in the water. I'm going to size this to be a little bit smaller, and then I might even take one more minus control point and just sort of stick it on the rocks up here to make sure that I'm not brightening or dodging that area too much. And the idea of these control points, as I click the new mask button, is again to be able to kind of control the viewer's attention throughout the image. So I can selectively dodge and burn without having to worry about making extensive selections. And they will create really nice, clean looking selections. And you can also clean up the selections. But I've spent 20 minutes talking about these control points at this point, and I want to make sure that we get into and talk more about specifically long exposure stuff. So, and also utilizing the Nik plugins. So I think what I'm going to do is just really quickly add a little bit of micro contrast in here, place that over here, put a new mask. I'm just going to work a little bit quicker on the stuff that we've kind of already done. I could talk your ear off about how these control points are working and why we might decide to place points where we're putting them. I'm going to actually cool that just a touch. There we go. And let's say I'm happy with this result. I can just click the close button in the lower right corner of the preview interface, and I can look at my image. Let's take a quick look at the before and after with the compare button. Here's the original image, so a little bit underexposed. We've used the white balance, DxO smart lighting, the contrast adjustments, and then some selective adjustments to kind of dial in the effect that we want. And then from here, I want to go into the Nik plugins. So I'm going to move into the lower right corner of Photolab. And mind you, the Nik plugins work exactly the same way from Photolab 2 or Lightroom, meaning they are both sort of parametric image editors. They allow you to deal with the raw data in the inherent software. So Photolab 2 deals with the raw information and Lightroom deals with the raw information. As soon as I go into the Nik collection here and click this button and go into Analog Efex Pro, what's going to happen is a copy is going to be made of our original raw file. It's going to say, are you sure? Because I actually already have a copy of this image. I'm going to go ahead and just overwrite it, and we're going to overwrite that previous photo. I could click use unique names, and what that would do is actually create a new duplicate file, but I don't need to do that in our catalog here, so or our browser rather. Anyways, as that launches, Lightroom is going to work almost exactly the same way. You would do, you'd utilize your raw process, however you might do that, and then you would go into your Nik plugins from there, and you would make a copy of the original image. Charles, that's exactly correct. You just said Watkins Glen, and this is a sort of not typical scene, but one of the main scenes walking up through the Watkins Glen. Cool. Okay, so I'm looking at my questions because I was letting Analog Effects Pro log in. Okay, there's a couple questions that are specific to the software. There's one person, I missed your name. Um, the webinar is being recorded, and after 24 hours after this webinar, you should get an email that has a link in it, and that link is going to have a recording to this webinar. The rest of those questions that I'm seeing, oh, somebody, Bonnie, you can't see anything. You're probably not doing anything wrong. You might need to log out of the webinar and log back in. All right, so keep the questions coming. I'm glad that everybody's working just fine here. Everybody can see my screen. We've opened up into Analog Effects Pro. And one thing that I really love to do with Analog Effects Pro is bring long exposure images into this software. And I like to play a bit, like I might go into classic camera number 2 because this icon looks pretty cool. Or maybe classic number 7 because that looks really awesome as well. I'm going to give this a second to load. Okay, so not that interested in that one now, but I'm going to click on classic camera number 7. Let's see what happens here. Analog Effects Pro is a piece of software that basically throws 200 years of photographic technology and enhancements right out the door and allows us to add dust and scratches. We can add a vignette. We can apply colors and tonal adjustments via a film type. There are ways to purposely throw off focus and distortion, and it's a really beautiful, creative tool that allows you to potentially create something that you couldn't otherwise. Or you could go out and buy a Holga camera, or you could go out and buy, like let's say a 4x5 or an 8x10 camera and create glass plate materials like dry plates. And you could emulate lots of well, you would actually be shooting those things if you did that, if you bought a Holga or a 8x10 camera or 4x5 and used glass plates for, let's say, tin types or dry plates. Here in Analog Effects Pro, we're able to walk around with our DSLR cameras or our mirrorless cameras and so on, and we can create these kinds of aesthetics very beautifully, very easily, and or you can create whatever effect you might want. And the beauty of this is that the problems that we had at the turn of the century, around the 1900s, all the way up until we have these really amazing, incredible digital cameras, we can emulate those sort of maladies, but we can control them. Whereas in shooting film, one of the kind of beauties is that you oftentimes can't control those random occurrences. Obviously, there are ways around lots of like light leaks and things like that, but the beauty of this software is that you can control exactly what's happening. And in fact, if we click and hold the compare button, what this is kind of doing is it's basically coloring the image right now, and it's adding a dirt and scratches filter and a little bit of a vignette. Now, the problem that I'm going to run into with this image and some of these filters is that the photo is kind of a high frequency image. There's a lot of texture and detail basically everywhere. So the filter like dirt and scratches isn't going to be that noticeable. If you had, let's say, like a photograph of an island long exposure image where there's an island out in the background and you've got some water, the filters like dirt and scratches or the photo plate filter, that's going to be much more noticeable. Whereas right now, the dirt and scratches, I can leave it 100%, and you really don't notice it until I start really messing around with it or turning it on and off. But what I wanted to do anyways is jump into the wet plate. So I've jumped into the wet plate camera, and I'm going to use one of these presets. So I'm going to click on wet plate number 6, and I'm going to walk you through the filters on the right side so that we can stylize this image and emulate, possibly shooting wet plate. Now, for those of you who are wet plate enthusiasts or possible experts out there, we are simply taking a digital image and converting this to make it sort of feel like it could have been shot on a wet plate or a dry plate or something of the sorts. And the sensitivity of our digital camera is very different than a photographic emulsion of those times. So we're not going to get the exact same effect, but we sure can get a really interesting effect, and we sure can control all aspects of it, which is really quite wonderful. So moving to the right side here, I've turned off the basic adjustments checkbox. I'm going to turn off bokeh or bokeh, dirt and scratches, photo plate, lens vignette, and film types. And we're just going to build this up. So I'm going to turn basic adjustments back on. And the basic adjustments filter is what's doing our sort of desaturation. It's converting our image from color to black and white. If I double click on my saturation slider, it's going to home the slider. It gets it back to its original setting, which is 0. I'm going to go ahead and double click on each of those sliders. And then I'm just going to increase my detail extraction very subtly. I don't need much in this image because we've already kind of massaged the tones quite a bit. But just because this slider kind of sticks out, this basically tries to, as you slide the detail extractor slider to the right, it tries to lighten shadow areas and darken highlight areas while retaining as much texture and detail as possible. Right, so as I slide to the right, it's not actually just brightening the image, it's actually brightening those dark values and darkening down the very brightest values. Did I say that right? It's brightening the darkest values, yeah, and darkening the very brightest values. But I don't think we need much, so I'm just going to bring that detail extraction up. I do want to convert the image to black and white, and in this case, the only way to do it is to take that saturation slider down. Then we're going to go to the blur filter. And actually, the blur filter allows you to utilize this sort of radial blur or a linear blur. And then you can control that linear blur with an on-image control. So I can go and adjust this and pull our our transitions out. And what you're going to see here is that from the center to this first line and this line, there is no blur occurring. And then from this line right here to the last or the outer line, there's a transition from very little blur to a lot of blur. Now, obviously, the amount of blur is going to be dependent upon the blur strength, and that's the slider over here on the right. But basically, the transition here is what's going to control this sort of transition from edge to blur. So this is a really great way of controlling this sort of edged blur. I actually think I'm going to jump back over into the radial blur. I kind of prefer that in this case. And a lot of the filters have these kinds of controls. We call these on-image controls with the Nik plugins. And basically it allows you to go into the image itself and just manage this. And it's a really nice control. And it allows us in this case to maybe just blur the very edges of the image in this way. And there are a lot of other controls that you can utilize, like you can boost the highlights. I don't know how many of the highlights we're actually going to need to boost here. You can see what happens. It's trying to emulate what might happen, when you have those out of focus, sort of the bokeh or bokeh area in a, let's say, shooting with a super short depth of field. Now, you can choose your aperture as well. So by default, it was a little circle. You can make it into a heart and then a star. And actually, as I click on these, let's go ahead and just bring this blur back down for a second so you can see what that's doing. You can actually see the shape of that aperture changing as we bounce between these. So it's quick once it goes, but you can see what it looks like. And so you can emulate actual sort of aperture blades, or you can kind of go in and there's a star, and you can actually change this as well. Meaning, like here's a star, but I can go into my aperture variation and I can make it this very sharp star, like a star burst, or something that's a little bit rounder. So that can be really fantastic aesthetically and for fun. And actually in other applications, it might work really well. I would say in this image, I want to make that effect a little bit more subtle. I kind of want just a little bit of blur around my edges to direct your attention as the viewer towards the center of the photograph. You know what? Another thing that I want to do, here it's already 7:30. This time flies. I'm going to jump back into basic adjustments. Some of the filters and tools within Analog Efex Pro have control point capabilities. The basic adjustments tool is one of them. So I can go in to add a control point. And again, what I want to do is sort of direct your attention. So I can go and add a little bit of brightness here, add a little bit of contrast. I think I could reintroduce saturation. Yeah, I don't want to do that in this case, but we could do that if you wanted to. And you could do that selectively using control points. So that could be another interesting capability when shooting long exposure photography, reintroducing some of that color. So I can add control points. Let's add a little bit of detail extraction and a little bit of contrast up here. There we go. That's really going to direct you, or the viewer. I shouldn't say just you, but whoever's looking at the picture. Reduce detail extraction, darken down the edge here. There we go. Now we're really starting to cook with fire. In fact, I'm going to use one more control point. And so um, I tried to tone the image initially how I thought I wanted it to be, but as I'm adding in these filters, I'm realizing I want this kind of control in Analog Efex Pro. And thankfully, we have this kind of control in Analog. So it's easy to kind of really hone these areas in. So that's basic adjustments. We've talked about bokeh or bokeh. Dirt and scratches, I don't think we're actually really going to even see much of anything, but there's a whole bunch of different like overlay textures that you can put on the image that range from organic to dust and scratches or dust and lint, scratches and eroded settings. And the organic one is emulates the look of like having mold on an image, or if your image was pressed up against a piece of leather for 100 years, you'd get this kind of effect hypothetically. So you can see as I turn it off, turn it back on, it's adding this extra element of effect. And it's this really nice way of layering as well. I find these dirt and scratch tools to be really handy in a lot of different kinds of photographs. Photo plate. So photo plate is actually what's going to be kind of emulating either a poorly poured, say that twice, a not so well poured wet emulsion on a glass plate negative, or something that's been worn away after several, like several years or 100 years or 50 years. And so the streaked photo plate specifically, so this might happen if you had a stack of dry plates stacked together, and there was oxygen getting into part of these areas and not into other areas, maybe not necessarily oxygen, but stuff that's going to make areas of the emulsion fade faster than other areas. And so here's where you can really kind of like start to fool the viewer, if you will, into making it seem like this is an actual film-based or emulsion-based photo. All right, I'm just gonna add a little bit of that. I don't know if we need the lens vignette in this case. Yeah, a little bit. The lens vignette also has an on-image control, so you can kind of go in and affect how far into the middle the effect goes. You can actually choose where the middle is going to be in your image, so we can actually move this down or to the left and so on. And then lastly, the film type. And I'm sorry if sometimes I speed up and slow down. I want to make sure that we get through all of the images. And sometimes I look up at the clock and I realize that I'm spending more time in here than I meant to. But I kind of get excited about talking about these things. And so I want to explain each and every slider and why I'm doing these things if possible. So I'm going to use one of these warmer settings. We're in the film types. There is a whole drop-down menu with a bunch of different sort of colored toned film types. And then you can control for the fade. So if you wanted to have kind of like a muted shadow and muted set of highlights in the image, so like a faded look, you can totally do that. Or if you want it more neutral, a little bit higher contrast, you can control that in here. And then the strength as well. I'm going to make it a little bit more subtle. So the highlights are going to kind of stay neutral in this case, but the shadows are going to have that nice warm tone to them. And then I'm going to increase the grain per pixel. And then we haven't even looked at the before and after at this point. Let's go ahead and take a look at the side by side. The original image looked like this. It's really beautiful in color as well, in my opinion. And then in the enhanced image with our black and white conversion with our subtle blur adjustments and so on, we've finished the photograph. I'm going to go ahead and click the Save button in the lower right corner. That's going to bring us back over into Photolab, or if you were with Lightroom, you would save the image back into your Lightroom catalog. Or if you were in Photoshop, what would happen is you would be duplicating the background layer and applying the filter that you've just adjusted to a separate layer. In fact, I want to jump over into Photoshop and show you that. So I'm going to give that a second to load. There we go. There's our final image. And I think we're going to come back over into Photolab because I'd like to talk about toning this image and then potentially converting that to black and white. But let's switch over into Photoshop. All right. So let's see here. This is the enhanced image. And this is just a technique that I think could be helpful to a lot of folks. Using control points and using a couple filters within Silver Efex Pro, I can kind of counteract the effect of the flare that's occurring here. And so what's happening, if you haven't seen this before, is I don't have a good lens hood for when I mount the filter on my camera, and it's probably a relatively easy solution that I could work with. Um, this isn't a particularly good photograph, in my opinion, but it has this problem, and I wanted to show you how to fix it because I think this is actually a really difficult one to fix, especially with control points. Whereas this, I've had this occur on other long exposure images, and it was actually easier to fix than this. So I want to show you what this looks like, and we're going to kind of neutralize the color that we're getting from this flare, and then also see if we can get a little bit more contrast and texture out of the rocks that we're losing because of this flare. So this one was shot on a Nikon, yep, and I believe I did close down the eyepiece. So if that was what you were going to mention, um, this can occur, this kind of effect can occur if you are shooting long exposure photography and you leave the viewfinder open on a DSLR camera. The light can sort of leak in there by closing down that little piece, or by if your camera doesn't have the ability to close down by basically putting some black tape or a hat over it or something like that, you can prevent that flare. That's not what this one was from in this case. I think it's just the sun was hitting this filter in the right or the wrong way, and it creates this effect in this case. But there's this sort of relatively straight line in this not so nice color. So we're going to get rid of it using the white neutralizer filter in Silver Efex Pro 4, and then we're going to add some contrast using Pro Contrast and then a little bit of this detail extractor filter. I'm going to start with white neutralizer. So for anyone not familiar, Silver Efex Pro 4 is a collection of 55 different filters that do all sorts of different things. In this case, we're going to use some of the filters that will help us to correct this issue. And to use the white neutralizer, in this case, the quickest way to go is probably to click on the little eyedropper tool in the upper right corner, and then I want to choose a kind of average tone and color to get rid of. So I'm going to go into, not the brightest value, not the very darkest value in that flare, but somewhere kind of in the middle. And as I click on it, it does a pretty good job right off the bat, but it has kind of changed the color throughout the whole image. So we're going to end up selectively placing this white neutralizer filtration in a second. But after I've chosen the color, I'm going to go ahead and increase my neutralized whites. You can actually see the stuff basically disappear. If you don't have this kind of flare, but you want to use this filter, I don't find myself often using the neutralized white slider up at 80%. That's uncommon for me in my experience. I'm probably closer to 30 or 40%, but in this occurrence, I think we need to really bring that really far up. And then the adjust whole image, this slider, it allows you, it's kind of like a tolerance slider. So if our initial color is this kind of magenta purple color, and the adjust whole image is at 30% right now, if we wanted to reach out further past that original color, we can slide the adjust whole image slider to the right, and that's basically going to increase the tolerance of the filter, meaning it's going to reach out to other colors a lot more. I don't know if we need to do that. I think I can actually decrease the adjust whole image pretty far. And then let's just look at the before and after. There's the before, there's the after. It's doing a really nice job in this case. And I would say we do need control points, but that's because as I toggle this on and off, I'm noticing I'm losing some saturation in the blue of the water here. So I'm going to take minus control points. I'm just going to place them in the water up here and maybe down here. And then after I've placed a couple control points, I'm going to toggle my white neutralizer filter on and off. And then I decide, okay, in this case, I need to add some plus control points back into the area that we want to really affect. And so the minus control points here in Silver Efex, that's going to remove, oops, sorry, as I zoom out. The minus control points are going to remove the filter effect. A plus control point is going to put the effect in that area. And this is pretty incredible. This is one filter, and we're able to basically get rid of that color cast that's occurring. And from here, I'm going to click the Add Filter button, and I'm going to go ahead and add the Pro Contrast filter, increase the correct contrast, increase the dynamic contrast. This is a wonderful, incredible filter, by the way. We're just going to apply this selectively because I don't know if we want to apply the Pro contrast filter everywhere in this case. But the plus control points also come, well, both plus and minus control points also come with these opacity sliders, so we can slide that up and down to decide exactly how much of that effect we want. So some of the control points, like in PhotoLab 2, you have adjustment control points where you can control the, the brightness, the shadows, the contrast, the micro contrast, the color and saturation, all in one control point. In color effects, the control point either places the filter effect that you're currently working with on the image, or it takes it off of the image. So they're different kinds of control points, but the way that they make their selection and the way that they make their enhancement is the same. It's just, in this case, it's only going to be applying the Pro contrast as opposed to a control point that has a whole bunch of different sliders. So definitely not perfect, but much better than it was originally. And we're going to kind of polish this up by placing the detail extraction on these rocks here. And the rocks have a little bit of that sort of saturated magenta color, and I want to get rid of that. So I can actually do that with the detail extraction sliders here, because this filter allows us to sort of increase texture and tone as I turn this on and off. But I'm also desaturating a little bit, and that's going to remove kind of whatever's left. But this is a really nice way, as we look at a side-by-side preview here, to clean up a kind of flare that might occur. So that's white neutralizer, Pro contrast, and the detail extractor. I'm adjusting it a little heavy-handed probably, but it's simply for demonstration purposes. I really kind of like the result here as well. I'm going to click the OK button in the lower right-hand corner, and you're going to see what happens when you apply a Nik plugin in Photoshop. And what's happening basically is you'll have your original background layer, and then you've got your enhanced layer of pixels that's been duplicated up. Wow, time flies. It's already 7:43. I feel like I just introduced myself. I don't even remember if I did introduce myself. If I didn't, my name's Dan Hughes. I was the webinar trainer for Nik Software from 2009 to 2014, and I teach photography at the Rochester Institute of Technology. And I show my students how to use this software as well. Anyways, let's see here. I'm going to transition into the Q&A here. I have like literally I have 4 more pictures to go over in case I somehow went through all of these images quickly, but I had planned on talking about a couple more images. So this photo, this photograph is a long exposure image. You can tell by the clouds, but you don't, like, there isn't too many other signatures of it. So I kind of saved it for the end, and actually it's a little higher contrast than I think I will like at this point. And I was going to show you how to optimize this workflow. So this was the original image that I kind of enhanced, and I think we could actually get to a similar result to this in probably maybe 4 layers instead of this many layers. But if we look at the original image, there's a pretty strong vignette on it, and kind of low contrast, although it has all the texture and detail that we need, and we're going to bring all that out. We're not going to have enough time to actually talk about that image today, but I figured I'd show you. So if you have any questions, feel free to type them into the questions box. Again, my name is Dan Hughes. I greatly appreciate you coming by the webinar, and hopefully you found this to be helpful. And again, we're only able to get through a few photographs, and long exposure photography is a massive topic. You can shoot all sorts of stuff, and my examples here I think are a little bit limited, but hopefully we talked about some solutions in PhotoLab and controlling contrast, fixing the flare using color effects, and a little bit within Analog Efex Pro. I feel like we need like 5 hours to really get into a topic like this. Anyways, I've got some questions that are in the questions box. I'm going to go ahead and jump over into those to make sure that we're good to go. James, you're saying you'd like to know how to download the files you need for PhotoLab 2 for your Nikon D300 and various lenses you have. Oh, so James, in PhotoLab 2, so first of all, disclaimer, I don't know every single camera that is supported by DxO PhotoLab. I'm going to imagine that the D300S is supported by PhotoLab because I have a Canon 10D and it's supported, and that is a much older camera than the D300S. So I believe it should work. And actually, James, when you bring images into Photolab 2, it should, sorry, let me rephrase this. When you kind of open an image from your photo library into Photolab 2, the software is going to kind of recognize the metadata of the image, and it's going to say, you don't have this module, would you like to download it? In this case, on this image, I didn't tell it to download. In fact, I purposely said don't download because I figured it would make for a good demo. But if you have the little camera that's showing up in the upper right corner, then that means that the lens camera profile or a combination hasn't been downloaded. So this module, I'll just click the download button. Hopefully this doesn't throw off our webinar, but now it has downloaded it. And basically that's going to update this image, and it's going to fix any distortion that might be occurring. And also, potential vignettes, although the vignettes that occur on some of these images are also happening because of the filters that I'm putting over my lenses. Okay. So yes, Gina, you're in luck because DxO Photolab Essentials does come with the Nik plugins when you purchase them. So if you don't have the plugins, you can totally do that. Chris, you said this should be a separate webinar. Let's go long exposure. Way too much information. Oh, yeah. Hopefully I didn't blow your mind, Chris. How do you guys feel about that presentation as well? Because I was hoping to get through a couple more images, but maybe maybe I need to. Oh, let's see. So Omar, do you have a book that explains in baby steps how to use Photolabs? I own it, but a bit scared of how to use it. Omar, no, but I think there's a good number of tutorial videos that can kind of get you started. A book would be really cool. I don't have the bandwidth right now to write a book on any of these pieces of software. I just enjoy, talking about it over webinars, but I have a feeling I'm giving a lot of information about this stuff. The webinar is about, oh, I see. Well, so yeah, Oscar, I'm sorry, the webinar was about not Analog Efex Pro, using the Nik plugins with using Nik plugins with the long exposure photography in mind. Let's see. Last week's HDR webinar was recorded. You registered but missed it. How do I get it? Stefan, good question. I think get in touch with I do webinars for DxO, and I think if you registered, you should have actually gotten a link in an email 24 hours after the live event. So if you didn't do that, you're going to want to contact DxO directly. And I don't really have a better answer for that because I think I have access in GoToWebinar to the HDR effects, but I don't have the ability to sort of send them out very well. Yes, okay, cool. Can the layer effects within the plugins or only adding in Photoshop? I'm sorry, Linda, so can you layer effect within the plugins or only adding in Photoshop? Linda, I think that matters what you mean by like layer effects. So there are no blending modes or individual like masks within any of the Nik plugins, although you have the control point capability in every one of the pieces of software. Oh, okay, wait a minute, I got a comment from Mark. If you use manual lenses and the lens info is not in the metadata, can the lens info be manually added to correct lenses? Mark, great question. I don't know that one. I hope so. I haven't thought about it or tried to do it. I have several manual lenses and a lot of pictures that are, but the ones that I have, I think still have contacts, so it still recognizes it. Thank you, Raphael. I appreciate that. Okay, how about we go through one more image? I'm going to try and make it through these questions, and then I'll stick around if you will, and I'll talk through one more long exposure image, the one that looks like a long hallway, in San Diego. Concerned about saying exactly what it is, but George, we need a part 2 of this webinar. I like that idea. Would love to see the last picture. Okay, yes, I will talk you through this photo. This photo does have some strange masking occurring, but I'll try to like narrow it down into a quicker version of the technique that I use to do this. Follow-up webinar dealing with more long exposure would be cool. Okay, too much DxO software, not enough long exposure. Good, I like that. Thank you for that feedback. That's very helpful. DxO has been putting webinars on their YouTube channel. Oh, perfect. Jill, great comment. Okay, so if you jump onto YouTube, apparently DxO has been placing a lot of these webinars on their YouTube channel. That's really fantastic to know. Gina, to reach out to DxO, I believe you go to the website and there's a contact section. And I think the only way to do it is via email. Multiple effects applied on one image. Great. Okay. All right. Couple more coming in. What if the control points could be like a lasso tool in Photoshop instead of a circle? Oh, that's a good, interesting idea for sure. Let's look at control points. But let's go into. We're going to start with Silver Efex Pro, and we're going to clean up this image a little bit. So let me delete all these layers. Let's start here. So to start with, I'm in Photoshop. There's actually 2 ways to access the Nik plugins from Photoshop. You can go to the filter drop-down menu and access them this way. Or you can go to the file drop-down if you don't have the Nik selective tool, which is basically a menu that pops up and allows you to access the Nik plugins. But if it's not showing up automatically in Photoshop when you launch the software, this is how you find it. You go to File, Automate, Nik selective tool, or Nik collection selective tool. And then your selective tool pops up, and then you just have this nice little dialog that you can deal with. So I'm going to go into Silver Efex Pro 4, and I'm going to work very quickly on this image. So I referenced the recording if I lose you a little bit, and if not, then cool. But I want to make sure that we can kind of get through this as quickly as possible. This is the white neutralizer tool because this was the first filter we used the last time we used the software. It's the one that the software opens up into. So whatever tool you use first in the last stack that you created, or the last filter application that you created. Dark and light center. So dark and light center, this filter is really, really wonderful in my mind for doing 2 things. It can direct your attention towards the middle of an image or towards this center of an image. You can actually place that center by clicking on the place center button. You can move that around if you want to. I'm going to leave it right in the middle because compositionally it makes sense in this case. But what I want to do is, instead of darkening the border and lightening the center, I want to kind of correct this vignette that's occurring because of the filters that I'm using, and also the lens combination. If I remember correctly, and we could probably just look at the raw file, I'm pretty sure I used the Nikon F4 16 to 35 millimeter lens. Let me re-say that. It's the Nikon 16 to 35 millimeter lens F4. And at this focal length, at the aperture that I shot at, which is probably around 5.6 or f8 or so, if I were to guess right now, there's a little bit of a vignette when utilizing these filters. So what I'm doing is just taking my border luminosity back down, and I'm paying attention to the edge, and I'm paying attention to the center, and I kind of want to just even this out just a touch. And then I'm going to take a minus control point. I'm just going to remove it off of the sky because I actually want the sky to go a little bit darker, because when we convert it into black and white, it's going to give me a little extra texture to be able to work with. So if we look at the compare button right now, we're just sort of cleaning up that vignette. There's still a little bit there, but it does a nice job. So I'm going to click the Add Filter button. We probably could do something similar to that in a slightly different way using Photolab or even Adobe Camera Raw. So from here, I'm going to add Detail Extractor, and I'm going to just basically dial the Detail Extractor filter down just a touch. Let's look at the before and after. So this is bringing out some of those textures nicely. You know what? Let's go ahead and bump this way up. I'm going to show you kind of an interesting trick. So the detail extractor is going to be applied globally everywhere at this amount, right? But if I take a plus control point and I stick it down here in the foreground, what the software is going to think is that I only want the detail extraction down here in the foreground. And so I like this in this case because I can place all of the effect in an area that I want to draw your attention to. So I can place like most of the effect in here, and then maybe up here with a, duplicating my control point. And then if I don't want any of the detail extractor anywhere else, I can start taking minus control points and removing it. Or if I want some of the effect on all of the image, I can kind of just take control points and drag them around and then take the opacity slider down a bit. And I told you I wanted to like explain or talk a little bit more about how these control points are working. We had a comment that came in about, wouldn't it be cool if you could, draw around an edge or use this like a lasso tool to make a different or more precise selection. The control points are actually trying to do that. So when you place these points, I'm going to take a minus control point, place it in the sky. It's making a selection inside of that circle of the object that you place it on, and it's basing that selection on the tone, color, and texture. So it will actually try to make a pretty clean selection. Wrong control points. So you can see what these control points are doing. Now they're not perfect, and it's not the same as like cutting something out in Photoshop, or with a lasso tool, but you can see the interaction that they have with these other control points. So the two control points that I just turned on right now are the first two. They've been placed in the foreground, and if I click on them and drag them around, you can see how it changes, right? And if we had a finely delineated edge, like these little windows here, you can see it does a really nice job to make a photographic looking selection. And if I size the area of influence to be really small, it creates a really clean selection. It's more photographic looking than it is something sort of traditional in Photoshop. We think of Photoshop as having like a clean edge, or making a mask using a lasso tool or a brush or something, or a edge detection, or the subject itself. These selections are going to work in a slightly different way. And yes, it would be cool or interesting if we had the capability, I'm going to go ahead and just click the OK button for now, to control the control points in a different way. But at the same time, if you're already versed in the tools in Photoshop, you can use the control points in combination with the layers and layer mask capability that you have within Photoshop. Because now in Photoshop, I'm back here and I have a layer, and I can add a layer mask if I see fit. So I know that doesn't really say, like, I agree, it would be cool if we could adjust the shape of the control points in what they're selecting. But I think what would happen is it would get so complex at some point that it wouldn't end up being that useful to us. Or it would be maybe useful to, the 10% of the users who would really take advantage of that, but it would just end up being more confusing than not to a lot of folks who aren't interested in that kind of capability. Or have the time to delve into that. Anyways, I'm generalizing. So I've opened up into Silver Efex Pro, and the interesting, fun capability that you have in Silver Efex and any of the Nik plugins is utilizing this stuff with layers and layer masks. So what I want to do here is create a high contrast, sort of dark, textured effect for a kind of background, right? And so what we're going to end up doing is actually converting this image to black and white more than once from our original color image. So like, this is really harsh to me right now, but it's not going to end up looking like this. And again, I'm trying to do this quickly, but long story short, the idea here is that we'll use multiple applications of Silver Efex Pro and then layer them together and be able to control them separately. And I know that I'm going to run out of time before I can get a really refined version of this. But I'm going to place a couple points, really hone this. So even this is looks pretty good. I'm going to remove some of the structure down here because this is just killing me of how much there is. Find structure, there it is. Reduce that. Okay, I'm happy with that. I'm going to click the OK button. That's going to, also the other thing I should have done was, this is a full resolution 36 megapixel file. I should have made it smaller. As that's saving, I'm going to jump back over into the GoToWebinar panel to see if people are still here. And shoot, too much. Okay. How are you getting the mask to appear? Okay, I'll show you that in the next application for sure. All right, minimize that. So we're back here in Photoshop. I'm gonna turn that off, turn it back on again. Cool, that looks good. What I need to do for my second application of Silver Efex is actually turn my layer off, click back onto Silver Efex Pro, and this is gonna be like a truncated version of this technique. I'm gonna make a similar image to what I just did a minute ago, but instead of making it as textured as I did, I'm gonna make it a little bit sort of softer overall. And then we're gonna start mixing the two exposures together. There we go, a little bit of structure. And then I'm losing texture in my sky, so I need to go ahead and darken this down. Add some structure. There we go. Okay, so let's say we're happy with this result. Click the OK button. Now we have two different black and white applications of the same image, right? So we're converting it from color to black and white 2 times. The key to that technique is turning off the Silver Efex Pro layer underneath so that you have color to then go and do this post-processing on. But now what we're able to do, we have this kind of flat representation of the image, and then underneath it we have this sort of higher contrast representation of the image. We can start to combine these things together. So we would do that by clicking on the layer mask button. You can only do this in Photoshop, mind you, because it's utilizing layers and layer masks. I should have mentioned that ahead of time. But now I can use the different tools in Photoshop to select, let's say, these walls. This is the quick select tool for anyone not familiar. It's a really great way to make like an initial selection. It's going to be perfect for what we're doing right now. So I make a selection of this area. I'm going to tap B on my keyboard, which is the brush tool, and then I can, oh, my opacity is at 10. I can go and basically brush the bottom layer out. And so what we're getting out of this is the higher contrast layer from underneath coming through. Now, where this really becomes interesting and really kind of beautiful is if you have like highly saturated colors in an image and you want to use something like a color filter, like a blue color filter or a red color filter. And then, so let's say you use a red color filter on a landscape image, and then you use the sky from that application of the red color filter. Then go back into Photoshop, turn off the Silver Efex layer that you've just applied, reapply. In fact, watch what happens. This time we're going to use some finishing adjustments because this will make it really obvious what we're doing. You could reapply your image with, let's say, a blue color filter. And I'm not talking about these tonings. I'm talking about an actual color filter that converts the image to black and white in a different way. And then you can go and combine those together. So let's burn that bottom edge. I'm going to drop a control point in the sky. And what we're going to do is finish this off nicely. Okay, so I'm going to click OK. I don't know if my aesthetic choices in this last layer are super effective, but watch what happens now when we combine our other two layers together. So I'm going to go ahead and make another layer mask. This time I'm going to use a gradient tool. So we'll use the gradient tool. Hopefully this one right here. What am I doing? Going too slow. And we'll drag this out. And what we're going to actually invert that. And so now what we have is the blue layer, this last layer, only in the center of the image. And then we have the second application in the sky and around the bottom edge. And then this first application, that's going to be just these things that are kind of leading you towards the center of the photograph. So that technique is incredibly powerful as to what you can do, and it's basically as powerful as you can imagine the different levels of layers that you could utilize. Anyways, hopefully that's helpful. I, I know we're way over on time, but anyways, if there are any questions, feel free to type them in. I've got some good feedback here in regards to, talking about long exposure compared to DxO, compared to the Nik plugins, and hopefully this has come together. I think what I'm going to try to do is separate those out a little bit more. So I do like to talk about PhotoLab because those control points are incredible and they relate directly into the Nik plugins. But maybe I'll only do one image and go a little bit lighter on it next time. And then maybe we can do PhotoLab specific webinars, but that's a different one. All right. Well, Richard, yeah, you're in luck. So there's actually another webinar coming up very soon. If I can open my Chrome here, and this is not the right window. You can see the stuff that's going on. Rondecoit Beer Fest. Anyways, I'm not going to be able to find it, but there are webinars coming up, and actually next week I want to say I'm teaching a Silver Efex webinar on sort of creative techniques. So I'll re-show this technique next week, and what I'll do is I'll hone it in so that it's a very specific image, so that it's very obvious as to some of the benefits of this technique. That was not the case with this image. It just happened to be that this was a technique that I used for this image. Anyways, ladies and gentlemen, have an absolutely fantastic week. Hopefully I see you next Wednesday from 7 to 8 p.m. Eastern. We'll be talking about Silver Efex Pro and sort of creative ways of thinking about applying Silver Efex. And I'll show this one again too. Sorry, let me rephrase that. I will show this technique again. And very cool. Dennis, awesome. Dennis is RIT grad. Dennis, I teach in the photo science program. I don't teach much of the science. I teach the first year introduction class, which is just pretty technical photography class where we talk about answering questions and doing it in a technically correct way, if you will. And then I teach some video courses as well. But very cool to hear, Dennis. I'm glad you made it. Thanks again, ladies and gentlemen. Have a wonderful week. Bye-bye.